Greetings, everyone. This is Valerie Fletcher. Welcome to the IHCD Global Webcast. I'm the Executive Director of IHCD and honored today to welcome two of the world's leading experts on disability and design. Amy Hamray from Vanderbilt University in the Critical Design Lab, and Josh Boys, London-based architect and co-director of the Disordinary Architecture Project. They are bold thinkers, teachers, and writers who articulate a conviction that good design requires the meaningful engagement of people most impacted when design fails. We share their belief that diversity of experience is critical to good design and to equity of opportunity. And we welcome two emerging leaders, both with recently earned Master of Architecture degrees. Scarlett Barkley, winner of the Architecture Journal Student Prize 2024 from University of Arts London, Central St. Martin's, and our own Paul DeFazio, who completed his MArch in 2024 from the Rice School of Architecture. Paul works for Amy and the Critical Design Lab and for us. So he is the perfect moderator for today's session. We'll have plenty of time at the end for questions, and we look forward to a real dialogue at the end. Please use the chat function on your screen for that. And we're going to try to keep that. We certainly can have conversation during the process, but we do have 4 speakers, so we want to make sure that it's all comprehensible. This session is open captioned as usual. We'll provide an archived version of the webcast within 2 weeks. And now I'm going to defer to my colleague, Paul DeFazio. Enjoy.
All right. Thank you so much, Valerie, for allowing me to kind of moderate the conversation today. And I'm so excited to have both Amy, Joss, and Scarlett, all of whom have been kind of incredible collaborators. And, Amy and Joss have been really amazing mentors for, a generation of disabled designers. And so I'm really so excited. And Amy, if you would you be willing to share the slide deck and we can get started? Great. And actually, it might make sense. So for today's conversation, what we decided to do was basically create a kind of Q&A interview format with slides. So that kind of will scaffold the conversation that we'll be having today. We'll be keeping the conversation kind of fluid, and people will be jumping in at different times. And I think that's kind of all we need to get started. So if people would like to introduce themselves and kind of I think the next slide is the theme slide. And we could maybe talk about who we are, and then we can start to talk about the project.
I'll start because I seem to be first on the slide. My name is Joss Boys. I'm a 70-year-old white woman based in London, UK, and I'm co-founder with a disabled artist called Zoe Partington of the Disordinary Architecture Project, which began nearly 18 years ago now, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this conversation.
I'm Amy Hamray. I'm an olive-skinned Iranian person. I have short, dark, curly hair and glasses. I teach at Vanderbilt University, and I run the Critical Design Lab. And for now, I'm still on the US Access Board. We will see what happens with that as our political situation unfolds. Paul, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Paul DeFazio. I am a light-skinned 30-year-old man with kind of disheveled hair in both the photo and today. And I am an architect, and I work with IHCD, and I've also worked with Amy for the past couple of years. I'll pass it to Scarlett.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Scar. I'm a white non-binary person, like 27, almost 28 years old. And I'm a neuroqueer architectural designer. But I work across a few different things and started doing some writing. And I teach at Central St. Martin's, as well as working with the Disordinary Architecture Project on a few different bits, some of which will actually appear in the later slides.
Great. So to kind of start the conversation, we have a few introductory slides and that are really just here to kind of give Amy and Joss a chance to talk about the new Graham Foundation grant that they've been working on, which is called Disability Meets Architecture. And so this first question is really just a chance to kind of open up, talk about like, what is Disability Meets Architecture? What are some things that you're hoping to do, and kind of give an introduction to the project?
I can start. I think, yeah, fantastic to get this funding from the Grand Foundation. The slide shows a couple of different sorts of texts. One is a big neon sign that was made as a series of disability neon signs by Joey Partington, my co-director, which says nothing about us without us. And underneath is a piece of text, a summary of the project. Shall I read it? Or shall we just summarize it? What do you think, Amy? Do you want to just summarize it?
Yeah, I think we can summarize it. Do you want to do that, or do you want me to do that?
I'll start, and then you can fill in all the bits that I've forgotten. I mean, I think we came to this really both with this idea that that we really need to be moving the field on beyond kind of just regulatory compliance. The Disorderly Architecture Project works very much. We were set up to work very precisely in architectural and built environment education and practice. Like, our aim is absolutely focused on trying to shift and enable the agenda to be more creative, more critical around access inclusion, to begin to even start using a different kind of language. So how can we not just, although regulatory compliance has a value, how can we move beyond that? And this comes into the idea of the field of critical access studies, which I'll leave Amy to talk about a bit more, but I think it is this idea that we need to develop richer terminologies, and that we need to find these ways to transform how architects work, what their practice is like, as well as what actually gets made, and how it's made available, accessible to a very wide range of people, and with a kind of sense of equality. And I think the key aim really is that we've called it positive frictions, as an idea that we need to make a kind of safe space where it's possible to have quite difficult dialogues about all the different ways that many really, the valuable efforts that are being made into supporting and working with and being led by disabled people towards a more equitable and more accessible environment and practices, and that there are different ways of doing that, and that we need to look at what those different ways are and how we can have constructive conversations about it.
Yeah, this is Amy speaking. I agree with everything Joss said. So Joss and I are part of a field of scholars within disability studies and architecture and design that kind of work directly with and are embedded in disability community and disability culture. And something I think that will be relatable to everyone here is that often those of us who are working for accessibility, we talk about how the code is just the floor, not the ceiling, and that we want to go beyond the standards and codes. And this is something that people have been saying as long as accessibility codes have existed. In the last 10 or 15 years, a really interesting thing that has happened is that within disability communities, especially within communities of people who are not trained architects, there's been a lot of new practices and theories and concepts around access that really push back against relying exclusively on codes and standards, and that even ask us to question why we think about accessibility in certain ways and not in others, or why certain people are included and others are excluded. And so what we're doing with this project, and with funding from the Graham Foundation, which for folks who don't know is a grant funder in the US that funds studies of architecture. And it's a big deal that we got this grant. It's like a huge honor. What we propose to them and what we're doing is recording conversations between architects and people in disability community, so that we can kind of trace how these ideas are being used, And also, as Joss said, the moments of friction. So where conflicts come up that can be really interesting for us to work through and resolve as we aim towards kind of better forms of access. So here we have a slide that just briefly outlines what those 5 conversations are going to be, and they are going to be recorded. The first 2 are conversations between Joss and myself. And then we will have one with an architect and a neurodivergence advocate talking about the concept of access washing, which we'll explain a little later. We'll have one between an architect and a long COVID advocate about issues of like productivity and capitalism, and also one between an architect and a disability justice activist about the concept of care.
Yeah, so I mean, thank you for that introduction to the project. And I think that it's a great, I really love also that we're having this conversation in this space, which is kind of, you know, an inclusive design space. And obviously there's a lot of overlap between our 2 sort of like sets of interests. And then also potentially kind of bringing in threads that people may not have been exposed to, or that might be kind of new to people. So I'm excited for that too. The next question really relates to the idea of, you know, both of your bodies of work. Like, what are you bringing to the project, and how does that form kind of the background and the stuff that you draw from as you're working on this? So, and I think there are 2 sets of slides starting with Joss.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I mean, this came out of, I actually got in touch originally with Amy just as a thought about doing something collaboratively in relationship to the Brown Foundation, because it felt like Critical Design Lab and Disorderly Architecture Project, they're different, they're operating in different contexts, they've got a different history, but that there was a set of things going on in both cases around, if you like, the language or the terminologies, or just the way that we talk about disability and access and inclusion, and in many ways move beyond even those concepts of access and inclusion and begin to think, as so many really fantastic people have, around ideas of disability justice. So it's a kind of real shift. And the Disorderly Architecture Project is what it does really is we're quite an informal platform, and we have a range of disabled artists in particular, but also increasingly disabled designers and architects who work into existing architectural practice and education, both in the UK and across Europe and internationally. And our mission is to promote activity that develops and captures models of new practice for the built environment, led by the creativity and experiences of disabled artists. So it's disability led. But we also look at, through that work, we look at doing things in a different way. We do a lot of work around kind of the notion of embodied practice. The image here is of it's actually in Copenhagen, of a group of students working together to turn each other's bodies into kind of drawing machines, and therefore to be imagining, to be placing themselves in space in a different way, and to be imagining how they interact with each other and that space differently. Kind of one of a series of kind of foundational projects we do like that are very, very much about working particularly with non-disabled, but also disabled architects and students, in terms of getting them to notice their own bodies as well as noticing the range and the diversity of other people's bodies. And as part of that, we do quite a range of different things, but more recently, we put together a kind of, we call it compendium, which is called Many More Parts Than M. Part M is the name of the building code in the UK around access, functional access. And we wanted to do something that was really different in reimagining disability, inclusion and access beyond compliance. So it's a kind of flip book. Paul, if you want to move on to the next slide. Sorry, Amy, if you want to move on to the next slide. Where the idea is it sits on an architect's desk, basically, or on a student's desk, and it's something to look at when you're bored. It's taking into account how difficult it is within the context of conventional architectural practice to think about these things and to have time and space to design differently. So the page I show here is the acknowledgements page, because this would not have been possible without a huge amount of fantastic work being done by disabled artists, activists, scholars. And that's what we built on. We just wanted to bring that knowledge and experience to the more conventional audiences of architecture and built environment. And it meant that we used a range of different language taken from that scholarship and activism and art practice. So we talk about beauty, we talk about care and repair, and they're all really just trying to open up different ways of thinking and talking. And Amy, if just the next one just gives an idea of the sort of way that the pages are organized. This was the design of this. Scarlett was really a key person in the design of this. So that's what we were doing. And then I was very aware that the Critical Design Lab were doing something quite similar, but different, again, because of context and because of what they were trying to do. So Amy, if you wanted to talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, so this is Amy. When Joss got in touch with me about putting one of our projects in the More Parts Than M compendium, I had shared with her, and I should just say, like, Joss, you and I have probably known each other for like 15 years or something at this point, kind of working in really like similar trajectories, and also like, we've met in many different contexts that were about critical access. And so it's really exciting to get to work on this together. In Critical Design Lab, which is a collaborative of disabled artists, designers, and researchers, that, currently we exist in 4 countries. So it's like based at Vanderbilt, but we have people kind of from all over the place who participate and do our work remotely. We started a project a few years ago where, really similar to the Many More Parts Than M compendium, we started to compile what are the ideas that are coming out in our community that, activists and disability advocates are putting forward that have relevance for design, but that a lot of designers may not know about. And also, what are the conversations we have in our lab, which is like a lab of all disabled people really working from within disability culture, bringing forward approaches to access that come from disability culture and community. Like, how do we translate this into something that anybody can kind of pick up and access and learn about? And so we had made a podcast for many years and actually just resumed this, where we would record conversations that we would be having about these kinds of topics so that anyone could get them. And then we started a project of compiling terms called the Critical Access Primer. And there are a bunch of terms, and each one has a plain language summary, which is a form of accessibility. There are different responses that people do to them. And so what's shown on the screen is actually Paul's graphic design and compilation of part of the Critical Access Primer. And it's in green and black, and there are different icons for different concepts. For example, Crypt Time has a clock, and Spoon Theory has some spoons, and there are also ones like Access Fatigue and Misfit, Crypt Technoscience. And our objective is to put this out in a bunch of different formats. So as social media slides, as a book, as podcast episodes, so that people can really quickly kind of like browse and take this up and investigate further if they are interested in something. And there are also like discussion questions and design charrettes and things like that. So as an example, and Paul designed this as well, here's the one for access washing, which is a term by the activist Stacey Park Milburn. And then one of our team members has like gone through the original text which was an activist, but also academic text, and simplified it into plain language so that it's just like easy to pick up and work with. Yeah, so we'll kind of show more of this as well later, but we can move on to the next question now.
Yeah. So basically, and now that we've sort of established this kind of these two bodies of work, kind of like the next question kind of segues from that and asks how those interests have converged in disability meets architecture. You know, what kind of are you expecting to get from collaborating together, and what kinds of kind of like intersections do you see between the two bodies of work that you both kind of have built over time, these two collections of vocabularies and ways of working and thinking about disability and design?
This is Amy. I can say really quickly that I think one of the things that we wanted to do was to push the ongoing conversations further. So we've been documenting them so far. But we started to say, well, what would happen if we put this person in conversation with this other person, and what new ideas might emerge from that? And so that's, part of our commitment to also growing a field around this, and understanding that the conversations are not over, that this is like an emergent conversation.
Yeah, and
Amy, if you'd like to, sorry, advance the slide. I think there is a image of your two projects together. Okay, great. Sorry, Joss, go ahead.
Oh no, it's fine, because I was going to follow on from that. I absolutely agree. I think it is that there are these really clear overlaps in what we're doing, and then there's differences in the most positive way, and then there's the wider field of conversation and discussion that's going on, and the way that that's developing, particularly in the States, rather worryingly at the moment, but also how that's happening internationally. What kinds of things can we learn by making a connection across the Atlantic? And I think the slide shows two screenshots from the websites of the Disordinary Architecture Project and the Critical Design Lab. On the left-hand side, there are a series of photographic images which have been taken from different projects that Disordinary Architecture has done as part of our kind of emerging archive. And it's really interesting to me. I think the expression critical access is really valuable, and it's not one that has quite such a it's not kind of been taken up in the UK very much, or in Europe. I think it might increasingly do so, but I think for us, for Disordinary Architecture, we're very interested in what counts as a kind of criticality, but as a Critical Design Lab is, that is completely intersected with creativity, with the kind of creativity of disabled experience and knowledge that is often goes unrecognized. Certainly in the architecture world that I know, disabled people, and many of the people in the audience too will know, disabled people are treated as kind of these rather passive users who need looking after and need to be given, need to be able to be as normal as possible. And although the issue around kind of disability pride is itself quite complex, I think that very much underpins the Disordinary Architecture Project. So I think that converging interest is also, it's not just that it kind of converges, it's like it's expanding a kind of richness, and out of that richness, the possibility of finding new things, other things that haven't, or different ways of doing the same things, but making them have more impact. I think that's what we're particularly interested in at the moment in Disordinary Architecture, is because we're a very small informal platform. We probably have 25 disabled artists or designers and architects that work with us quite a lot as regulars, and then probably access to another, I don't know, 20, and an increasing number actually of others who might come in on one project. But in terms of, so we need to make an impact. We need to actually see that what we're doing can enable a certain sort of transformative change, or even maybe a minor change. So this project really is a way that's, to me, how those converging interests work. And Amy, I don't know, do you want to say a bit more, Amy, about the Critical Design Lab?
I can maybe say it in the context of the next question, if that makes sense. Paul, do you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that that would actually be perfect because, yeah, so the next question is, what is critical access studies, which is kind of one of the primary academic interests. So I think this would be a great segue into that.
Yeah, so on this slide, I'm showing the cover of a few books. Graham Pullen's Design Meets Disability, Joss's edited collection, Disability, Space, Architecture, and my book, Building Access. There are many other books also in this field, but when I was writing my book, Building Access, which is a history of universal design in the US, and I was kind of like reviewing the literature, something that I noticed, and also because I'm a historian, is that when the ADA passed in 1990, there were two things that happened at the same time. One was that a lot of people were very relieved that the ADA finally existed and that it was possible to kind of move ahead with implementing these design standards. And at the same time, a lot of people in disability community and also universal design advocates and other people were saying, okay, but let's remember that we need to go beyond these codes and standards, that this is still just the bare minimum. And critical access studies is a field within disability studies and design and architecture that kind of picks that up. And so there have been a number of scholars in the last like 10 or 15 years, I mean, longer than that now, honestly, who have asked questions like, who is access for? Under what conditions is access allowed to exist? How is access related to different kinds of power and politics? Who tends to get excluded from accessibility when we think about like who is included or excluded from the disability community? How is access related to race and class and gender and these sorts of questions? And then also just asking questions about access itself and trying to bring more complexity to that. And so the work in this field is really trying to do that. And it's work that I would say people have been doing as long as access has existed. And, you know, the Institute for Human-Centered Design came out of adaptive environments, which was an organization that very early on was asking really important critical questions about access. And Elaine Ostroff, who founded it, was you know, thinking about how people with intellectual and developmental disabilities would get excluded from talking about physical access and stuff like that. And so, you know, we're kind of part of a genealogy or like a longer term history of people who are asking these questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, coming into this at that time as a non-disabled architect trained person, is that although now that as I get older, the complexities of what counts as an impairment gets more complicated for me. But I was really just finding out about those histories and finding out about that scholarship and finding out about that activism as something that I'd never been taught or had any connection to at architecture school or as an architectural teacher myself, was really enlightening. Like, it was incredibly vibrant, often very angry, often very just incisive and raising issues that just never came up. And so the Disability, Space and Architecture book, The Reader, was really just me trying. It's an edited edition of some of that scholarship and some of that creativity, just trying to bring that to a wider audience, to just say, it's kind of crazy that this isn't part of how, this isn't just built into how architecture and its related disciplines are taught and practiced. It's like, because it's so much about built space and how and a really critical understanding of how built space works and the complexities of negotiating it with a non-normative body and or mind. And so it's a very simple thing that that it felt like it was really important that it happened. And I so value the work, you know, the many different people in that book, let alone all the people it didn't cover. And then, Amy, if you go to the next slide, I think, you know, it's also that thing about all different, the kind of that history of activism too, and that history of in the UK, and it's very similar in the States. Disabled artists were so central to the kind of campaigning activities, particularly in the 1990s. I mean, earlier, obviously, huge amounts of like the independent living movement, some really powerful work also. And there's four images on this slide. On the top left is an artist that we sometimes work with called Barbara Lezitsky, who was very involved in those 1919 campaigns in the UK around transport, around refusing a kind of charitable understanding. The picture next to that, which shows a figure flying against a wall, is a deaf artist called Aaron Williamson, who's a live artist who does really quite surreal things and who invented the term deaf gain, because he was suggested that it was always seen as a loss and that for him it was real gain. Then we have there's a picture of Sonia Boye, who is just beginning to work with extraordinary architecture, but is also a very well-known neurodivergent artist in her own right, where they're holding up a picture of a face in front of their face. And the final picture is somebody who does work with us quite a lot, Naomi Lattmeyer, who makes this incredible work. This is an image of her in the Sydney Opera House being held up by an enormous amount of balloons. And so the reason I want to throw that in, I think, is we have just such a rich array. We have the scholarship, we have the history, we have the quality of artistic and creative practice. And somehow the way that compliance works, the regulations work, even some of the language around universal design works, is that somehow just gets smoothed away and made invisible, from my point of view. There may be people here who feel that I'm overstating the case.
Yeah, and I think that leads us to this next question, which is also kind of important, and particularly in talking about kind of like critical access studies and the critical design lab, which is really fleshing out this term critical, which you know, is something that I think has a history of being connected to, you know, ideas of being kind of like critical or contesting ideas, and that is definitely an important part of critical design. But I think like what both of you have showed in your work so far is that, you know, being critical also includes kind of like bringing in really interesting perspectives, creating these sort of nuanced conversations, and sort of even, you know, imagining possible worlds. You know, there are a number of ways to think about it, but I wanted to ask what the term critical means to each of you. I think the first slide here is a few books that I chose that Amy has referenced before, so maybe that would be a good place to start, and then I think Joss has some books after that.
This is Amy. So my favorite definition of critical or critique comes from the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who says that, you know, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says a critique isn't the same thing as an attack, but it is when you ask the questions that make it impossible to just take something for granted from there forward. So if there are things about the world that we just kind of, we move through the world and don't really think about, like from that moment on, we always have to ask, why is it this way? And, you know, accessibility itself is a critique, because it says the built environment was not designed with, you know, many kinds of people in mind. And there are also critiques of accessibility. And I don't mean the kinds of critiques where people try to like get Section 504 declared unconstitutional, but critiques from within our community where we say, how could we actually have a more inclusive idea of access? And so This is related in some ways to a field within design called critical design, which is actually creating design where the design itself makes us ask questions. And it's the sort of thing where you're like, oh, I guess I never realized that this thing was this way. But now that I've understood it that way, I see the world differently. And some of the texts for me that have been really helpful for thinking about that are Ivan Illich's Tools for Conviviality, which is shown here. It has some different technologies like sewing machine, bicycle on the cover, Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby's Speculative Everything, which has this sort of abstract green like structure on wheels on the cover. I'll also say Graham Pullen's book, Design Meets Disability, which was on an earlier slide, is very much about this in the context of disability. And then a book that I really have appreciated a lot and has informed a lot of like how I think about access and disability, which is Leslie Keynes Weissman's book, Discrimination by Design, which is a feminist critique of the built environment. And she actually, like after she worked on this, she started working on disability access stuff. You know, these are books that you might read in architecture school or design school that kind of raise the question of how can we actually like make things that don't just work well, but that introduce questions for people and how they're experiencing them. And these are, Paul, I think you put these on here. Do you want to say anything about these books?
I think potentially Joss put the slide on. Is that correct,
Yeah.
Joss?
Actually, this was me because and it completely follows on from what you just said, Amy, really, because it is just there's so many. I feel like there's a really growing a body of work around critiquing why it is this way, why the practices we have, kind of conventional practices of how the built environment gets made and how it gets occupied, how they can be not only challenged but also rethought. So and this seems to me to be really, in relationship to architecture, this seems to me to be, and the cultural sector, it feels like a really expanding field. It feels quite exciting that that's happening. So I show 6 book covers, The Architecture of Disability by David Gisson, Architecture's Disability Problem by Wanda Laberman, The Agency of Access by Amanda Cashier, a book with a very strange cover of a kind of star system called Neuroethics and Bioethics, Neurodivergent and Architecture, which is again an edited collection that I did together with Anthony Clark and John Gardner. Crypt Spacetime, sorry, I'm so bad on names, even though by Margaret Price, of course. And then After Universal Design by Elizabeth Guffey. So I'm just referencing people that I know immediately, mainly American, who are really just really looking at in a different way about who is valued and who not, and how that gets literally built into contemporary everyday practices and the spaces we occupy, and how we might move beyond that. So that feels to me to be very fruitful.
I also wanted to jump in and say, I think Wanda is here in the audience who wrote Architecture's Disability Problem, and everyone should go buy that book because it's like the best book about why the field of architecture is so ableist. And I think someone asked a question in the Q&A that's related to that too. So I'd encourage you to read that book.
Yeah, so many amazing books that for people to check out, including, you know, some of the earlier ones as well. And then, so the next kind of question, which is going back a little bit to the project that you're both starting with the Graham Foundation, which is really like, so we have this project which is about conversations between architects and kind of different people and who work in kind of interesting sects related to disability studies or other places. And so the question is, what kind of conversations do you hope to encourage? And that might be between the architects and the people you're talking about, and it might also be kind of beyond that with the conversations beyond the project too.
I'll talk to this slide because I put it in, but I'd also love both Scarlett and Amy to jump in. This is divided into 3, and there's a photograph and then a brief paragraph underneath. The first one is just, you know, having conversations and having conversations that go across disciplines, that go across kind of knowledge groups, look at the way different languages might come together. So just making safe spaces for those kind of disability-led conversations, I think, is the first one. And the image shows an event we did as part of the London Festival of Architecture, led by something called a group called This Collective, which brings together a disabled architect and a disabled artist, with David Gisson and a whole group of people sitting together, having a conversation. Then it's this thing about how we might have different concepts and different languages, what kinds of terminologies might we use to talk about and more creatively engage with disability in the built environment. And then it's spreading the word. We've just begun. We're just trying out some podcasts. I think that the Contra podcast that Amy leads on is a fantastic exemplar of how this might go forward. For us, it's quite new. This is called Disordinary Dialogues, and these were led by and organised by a blind artist we work with quite a lot called Mandy Redvers Rowe. So I'm just taking that, what conversations do you hope to encourage, at its most simple level, which is more of them, different kinds of language, and ways of spreading them so that they're more impactful. But Scarlett, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, thanks, Scar here. I thought I'd actually kind of slightly bring in the earlier question around kind of what's critical mean. And I think my understanding around these kind of series of conversations is that idea of how do you connect up different thinking, different ways of different people thinking, and offer a kind of reciprocal critical lens to each other. And that being an essential part of both building a kind of a movement within disability justice, but also thinking beyond that in terms of other kind of social justice movements. So we've invited people as part of this who part of their practice is in relation to disability justice, and we're primarily focused on that, but they're also bringing in other parts of their lived experience into that and other interest sets they might have. And so kind of really the importance of where do those conversations go is it's showing the way in which all these ideas can be connected up, but also where they start to kind of conflict with one another as well, and they kind of misfit. And in those moments and that kind of those frictions, as we've kind of been talking about, how that actually pushes on the debate and conversation in all of those respective social justice movements. And doing it in this way, you just make that, it makes it visible, the thinking and the depth of thought which is already going on between people within community with each other, but spreading that to the audience, both those who are already on side, but also kind of saying, look, this is happening. We've got some ideas, and really you should be listening to us. You should be involving us in these discussions, because actually there's a huge amount of thought and thinking which has already taken place. And there's so much more that could be had as well. There's so much more that could be creatively kind of considered and could impact the way in which you think about space and design well into the future. We're essential, really, as part of that discussion. Anyway, that's my thought.
This is Amy. The one thing I'll add is, so like a few years ago, I started doing something that was kind of atypical for me, which is that I went from producing scholarship and doing writing that was often very critical of focusing exclusively on accessibility standards to also working for a federal agency that produces accessibility standards. And I learned a lot in that process about what it might mean to bring the kinds of conversations we're having here to the standards, so that the standards themselves are of a higher standard and of a more kind of creative standard. So, something that I think we're all very aware of is that there's usually a lag between, various forms of research and what becomes an accessibility standard. And there are also these political restrictions, in the ADA originally that said, certain disabilities are not included, or that, there's certain areas that we can or cannot make standards for, like there are often political reasons for that. And so I started to kind of just like have conversations with people about the disconnect or like the differences between this very kind of like bureaucratic standardized approach to access and the sorts of ways that disabled artists practice access and disabled designers practice access, and that tend to be more like creative and experimental and open-ended. And that was really interesting to watch, kind of like what conversations could happen as a result of that. And we're in kind of a funny time where it's unclear what's going to happen with standards going forward, but I do think that it shows the importance of education and of conversation, and to not think about these necessarily as separate spheres, but as spheres that can inform each other. And so one of the types of conversations that we were also hoping would be part of this is like, the disabled architects who are so good at ADA compliance, like we really want to know, what do they have to say about all of these critical concepts as well? And it really like goes both ways, I think. And it could give us some clues into how to navigate the potential loss of disability rights or the loss of standards through approaches that are not restricted to the legal space.
Yeah, those are all three really, I think, great answers that also start to even have a conversation between each other. And I think also like where you left off really kind of segues us into this. I think it is very important to talk about the political moment that we're in. I have a few slides here related to the question of like, how can critical access studies inform our understanding of the present political moment? And if we go to the next slide, I have two images. One is a kind of headline, a slightly older news article from 2020 that says blocking the ballot box, ending the misuse of the ADA to close polling places. And then you go to the next slide, there's a sort of infographic of I think it was 17, but now it's down to 15 states that were, suing are basically trying to challenge the ADA and say that Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act is unconstitutional, which happened quite recently. And so, yeah, I think you've both started to answer this, and really all three of you feel free to jump in here. But I wanted to ask kind of like, how does the work you're doing right now, how do you think of it in this political moment? How does it speak to the kind of moment that we're in? And kind of like, what are the things that you're thinking about?
This is Amy. So there are a few things for me, and Paul, these two examples that you pulled out, I think are really important, because one has to do with racial disenfranchisement under the auspices of the ADA. So using ADA violations to shut down polling places in majority Black districts in Georgia. And the other has to do with anti-trans policies and litigation being used to then roll back Section 504, which is the sort of foundation of federal disability rights law and in the ADA. And so in both of these cases, like what we're seeing is that disability is kind of used as a political volley. And the people who get hurt through these types of actions include disabled people and also trans people and Black people and people of color. And it really highlights the importance of practicing solidarity and having an intersectional approach across all of these struggles. Like that's the first thing. The other thing for me is that, you know, for many of us, the like disability rights have only existed as a matter of like federal law for a portion of our lifetimes. And so it's a very recent phenomenon. And we are going to do everything we possibly can to make sure that disability rights don't go away. And there was a time when we were alive when there were no legal rights, or there were very limited legal rights, and people did other things to survive. And we can learn from those things, and we can learn from the people who did those things, because many of them are still alive and they can teach us. And I think about like in the disability movement in Berkeley in the 60s and 70s, before any kind of legal accessibility standard, there were architecture professors bringing disabled clients into the design studio. There were people kind of like working in the community alongside disabled people to make the built environment accessible. There were disabled people like hacking their own technologies, producing their own technologies. And this is just one of many examples. And so I think like critical access can guide us to also doing those things at the same time that we're trying to make sure that Section 504 does not get ruled unconstitutional, and that they have to be related, because we can't always rely on the law, because the political system changes and it doesn't always work democratically or work within our interests. And so we have to make sure that we're also like addressing kind of societal level theories and considerations and practices and things like that.
Yeah, Amy, I'll also just highlight something. I think in the beginning, like you mentioned, the kind of importance of like, the first slide being using accessibility to kind of close polling places in historically Black districts in Georgia. And then this also, like this most recent challenge to the ADA being a kind of like being kind of disguised almost as like an anti-trans piece of legislation, and maybe also emphasize the fact here that in this political moment, there's a lot of talk about kind of like coalition building and kind of like interdependence, and just kind of maybe highlighting the idea that before that the ADA and Section 504 is really founded on civil rights laws, that crip theory comes from, in a lot of ways draws from queer theory, and that really disabled people have historically been kind of like in solidarity with those groups, and sort of we all borrow from each other and kind of create these rights together, and that solidarity remains really important. And if Joss and Scarlett have anything to add, please feel free to jump in too.
I was just gonna Scar here. No, I think that was the thing that also I agree entirely with Amy and Paul, and particularly that idea around solidarity and the way in which we get separated. We get separated theoretically in terms of into different bodies of theory. We get separated in terms of the conversations that happen as well. And it's a necessary part of theorizing and also practical application that we start to work with one another. And that we can also continue doing that, because there is also a strong lineage of that already occurring. But also there's an erasure in terms of how that's documented. And there's a potential erasure that's going to happen now as well. And so on one level, I imagine these conversations that we're trying to have also occurring as a way in which to archive these conversations and ideas having existed, and also to provide a record of that, which has longevity, and also has reach as well. I mean, me and Joss are in the UK, but there's obviously, it's a very scary political climate, and there is an awareness certainly in Europe of the likelihood of right-wing governments in the next 5 to 10 years. And similarly, I mean, I work on alongside this on trans projects, and I also work here in critical theory and as part of a queer research cluster. And there's a hugely overlapping concerns existing in all of those different projects. But it's important to also then dig into our kind of, as Amy was saying, our toolkit of that we do know how to survive, and we know how to work together. We're actually very, very good at it. It's kind of digging into that toolkit to try and work out how are the ways that we maintain what we've built, so that when we're able to kind of find those moments to kind of reclaim space for ourselves, and also do that through a way we're advocating for other people as well. Yeah.
I wonder if I could ask Joss and Scar, so the word austerity, I think, gets used a lot in the disability rights context in the UK, not so much in the US, maybe because in some ways that's kind of where we're at, but it's about to get worse. So do you have any thoughts about like how critical access has responded to austerity and austerity politics, and what those of us in the US might learn from that?
I think that there's very parallel things that have been going on for some years, really, in terms of the differential effects that non-normative groups you find in capitalist societies anyway. And I think that what's been interesting here in relationship to that long-term austerity agenda that really has not only really impoverished disabled people as well as people of colour, working class people, is that there's some really interesting artist work around that kind of activity, around the things that Scar was talking about, recording, mapping, making memorial quilts, and about the number of deaths has been since the Department of Works and Pensions have been really punishing disabled people, and so I think that there is, as there is in the States, there's that kind of campaigning work. And I guess, this is really maybe takes it too far, but I think as somebody who was part of kind of feminist and civil rights movements and human rights movements in the 70s, and the kind of I feel like we need to be shifted. We need and have been developing a range of different kinds of tools, and that the kind of mass protests, which had huge power in that period, are much less that the capitalism and systems of power have worked out how to deal with that and just ignore it. And so it feels like these other more creative interventions into and kind of exposures, and again, as Scar said, of kind of recording and witnesses and communicating the effects, the differential effects, and the possibilities of working in a different way. I don't know, Scar, would you say? I think I feel like they're quite similar.
I've been mapping out an idea while we've been speaking, which has been nice. I think there's something around, so obviously the UK specifically in the last 10 years, leaving the EU, has entered this period of kind of extended isolationism, which you can kind of see the US is also really, really leaning into. And the effect of that on the UK was an economic decline, a protracted economic decline. And the way in which that's been used politically, in order to kind of serve particularly the right, it's been used because people have seen a huge drop in living standards. And there's been a kind of scapegoat culture. There's always a scapegoat culture of who gets blamed. And what ends up happening is people are put in opposition to one another. And I think sometimes the issue with that is, well, there's plenty of issues with that, but there's this moment where you don't start to see people as whole people. You only see them through kind of archetypal understandings of one another, which kind of serves the way in which news and propaganda is put out as well. And it just has this kind of like continuous eroding effect. And what I think is really important about the work of Disordinary and Critical Design Lab is this kind of emphasis on understanding all the parts of someone and all the things they can be, and the way that they have creativity kind of beyond the way in which society might externally perceive them or perceive what we can do and understand, and the complexity and kind of like comparing and bringing all these things together. So I think that that's really essential. I think that the point around capitalism is, I think, probably also super key, because there is this issue. I mean, one of our episodes is about productivity as well. And then I suppose I also was thinking in that moment about what actually needs to happen is you kind of need you need to take a little bit from Crip time and understand that there needs to be a slowing down process of kind of really settling in with ideas and with each other, so that we can feel more connected to one another. So we meet each other in a different space than that which has been created externally by people with different political motives. Which is what we're kind of trying to do, I suppose, or trying to do through a few people being able to have these conversations like we're doing now. This is basically a trial run. Yeah.
And I find that interesting because I think, going back to what Amy was saying, you know, on the one hand, there's a really important thing of working at the level of policy and legal challenges. And that has to be, in the current context in the States, that has to be incredibly quick and incredibly well organized. It's like a fast activity. And then I think what you're saying, Scar, is that we don't need to be rushed into the other things that will enable us to thrive in a kind of everyday way, and with solidarity with each other and support across each other. And I do, I mean, we've talked about different forms of activism. What we haven't talked about is how disabled people have dealt with the pandemic, how the AIDS epidemic was dealt with, how people are attempting to deal with some of the issues of climate change and the wildfires. That there are a whole set of things that require both that very fast kind of immediate response, but
Yeah.
I think that it's just the amount of energy that we have that
Yes. The pacing. Yeah.
The pacing, but you get caught up in that kind of pacing, and the slower work gets left out, or just there isn't time for it.
No, it's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I've been teaching this year, and it's quite interesting the way in which, once you teach students about kind of spoon theory and Crip time, and that starts to become more embedded in the way in which they kind of just operate. The spaces that they then create for each other, and the types of the vibe, I suppose, for lack of a better word, they manage to create, then means that actually people can be much more vulnerable. And there's a different relationship between students as well that then occurs, because they feel like they can enter that space fully as themselves. Like they're not filtering stuff through kind of like, I'm this professional hegemonic architect who's I'm sitting outside. They're able to sit in. And the thing is also that idea around Crip time, it's not necessarily that the idea of like slowing down, it's not necessarily, it's about pacing. It's about pacing, going at the pace which is right, or feels right, or is what's needed. And you're not necessarily getting there any more you're going to get there probably more efficiently, weirdly, by taking the time that is required to do the things. And then, as you're saying, kind of thinking about working on these two different levels, thinking about on a kind of legislatively coded level, but then also on a kind of activist level, that then reoccurs in queer theory if we're talking about like homo liberalism and like what is seen as kind of like kind of queer liberation or not. And actually it's not that necessarily what's legislatively coded is the thing that's never the thing that's out front, that's doing things first. It's the thing that follows. And there are plenty of ways we have to be able to be doing a bit of both. But there's plenty of ways that we can work out how to do the stuff which comes beforehand. That means that this becomes something which people feel like they should do or they need to, or they're just like, oh, okay, well, you're already doing it. But it's understanding those levels and understanding that energy and where you're placing that energy, which I think is really important.
Yeah,
Scarlett, oh, sorry, Amy, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, a really valuable practice in disability communities is mutual aid. And it's the idea of like, figuring out what you have to share at the most local level that there is. And sometimes that's picking up groceries for people or whatever. But for designers and architects, I think that there's a version of this, which is that if Section 504 is ruled unconstitutional and there doesn't seem to be a legal imperative to do access, you can still build access in everything that you do, and you can work with community groups to get the corner store made accessible or whatever. Like there are these things, just like immense ways that architects can be helpful with this, and that I think you all know that it is in some ways about cultural shift and not just obeying regulations. And so if those regulations were to go away, like we will be depending on architects and other kinds of designers to do mutual aid wherever, like whatever the places are that you touch, and to kind of use your expertise and skill set for that. And there's probably a version of that like all of us can do. And that's how we're going to survive. That's like how we're going to support each other and get through whatever those shifts are that are coming.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to go, Paul?
I was just going to say, I was going to quickly define, or maybe Scarlett, would you be willing to define also for people who might not be familiar yet what kind of crip time and spoon theory are for, the audience as well?
I can have a go. I think my crip time definition is always a bit rusty, to be honest. But so spoon theory is I actually find it really useful for students to kind of understand, because there's always this culture of exploitation in architecture schools where they're expected to go at 100%. And spoon theory is this concept that it's around energy levels. Different people have different energy levels, and different tasks require different levels of energy as well. And so you kind of convey, Josh, jump in if I'm off, you convey your energy levels based on spoons as a kind of metric of energy measurement. So an example would be, if I'm talking to a student, I might ask, how are you feeling today? How many spoons do you have? And we would work out what they could do that week on the basis of how many spoons they said. So they might come in and say, I've just got a handle left. And you're like, okay, well, we'll do something quite small. Or they might say, oh, I've got 3 or 4. I'm feeling good. And you're like, okay, well, we can do something more ambitious. So it's a thing which allows people to describe the amount of energy that they have and the capacity that they have on that given day or given instance. And you gradually lose them perhaps through the day as you do different things. And it also means that people are less likely to kind of say, I'm fine, if you ask as well. So it's quite useful, really. And then crip time, I've always kind of understood as this kind of, it's a contrasting thing. It's similar to the idea of, I suppose, slow time that you might occur in other fields, but it's this idea. It's also kind of anti-capitalist time, but that different people and different activities run at different paces and require different lengths of time, and this practice of understanding time through both energy and also what you personally may require in a given instance, or what participants that you're working with may require in a given instance, and working with that as opposed to a kind of external construct around productivity and what you're supposed to do in a set time. Does that sound okay?
Oh yeah, I think that's perfect.
Okay.
And yeah, they're both such useful concepts for thinking about, putting the brakes on a culture that expects disabled people, but also everyone else to be kind of like on and productive and have limitless amounts of energy all the time. I know Joss has talked about that a lot too, and I think that was the first time I sort of started hearing about crip time was in your work. But I think it's particularly useful in the context of architecture to think about, because architecture has such a problem with kind of like the labor expectations and the identity that we think architects should have as this sort of like inexhaustible person. And crip time really challenges that. And so does spoon theory, this idea that, we have increments of energy, and some of us may have more or less spoons. Some of us may start the day with 5 spoons versus someone who starts the day with 10, depending on any range of factors. And that kind of really impacts, the way that I think about work and time and timeliness and all those things. I'm wondering if we want to, I think we have a couple of questions left, and yeah, maybe continuing, I love how kind of fluid the conversation has become, and maybe sort of like continuing into talking about disability justice, how that movement informs our work. If you go to the next slide, we have an image of the cover of the Sins Invalid documentary, which is a kind of documentary about this disability performance group in the Bay Area called Sins Invalid. They have done sort of like disability arts, but also created this list of principles, which is the set of principles of disability justice. And they're a little too far away for me to read, so if someone else could read them, that would be great. But we have on the other side sort of an image of, I forget the dancer's name, but a woman in a wheelchair. They're kind of upside down underwater, doing a sort of like one of the valid performances. So I think maybe the best way to start this section of the conversation would be to have someone read the principles, and then maybe if we could talk about one or two that feel really kind of like important to this work and why they're important, that would be fun.
I'm happy to read them out. It's Joss. Intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted, anti-capitalist politic, cross-movement solidarity, recognizing wholeness, sustainability, cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation. And I found these principles incredibly helpful, I think, in terms of how we have ways that do really start from the experiences of those who are most impacted with forms of discrimination and devaluing and demeaning and lack of access to space, to resources. In architecture, sometimes, rather than use the expression disability justice, rather pompously, I say social, spatial, and material justice, because that kind of connects more to the actual, what's actually going on in terms of where architects sit in a much bigger world of property development and land and property being capitalist assets, where the kind of really underpinning mechanisms by which inequalities of power and wealth continue to be perpetuated, a kind of actually central to what architects do, even though they may have little control over it and little power in that particular process. So for me, anything this is, I think, Cynthia Valler's stuff is so powerful. It takes us beyond. It's a way out of access and inclusion. I have a problem. People have heard me say this before. I have a problem with both those terms, access and inclusion, when access is treated very mechanically, because it's like access and inclusion means, if I think of myself as a white, non-disabled woman, I provide access. I include others with me. They come to me. I say, you can have access. You can be included, but I don't have to change at all. I'm just the same. I'm just behaving, empathetically and nicely. So I feel better about myself. But that's a really weird thing. And what's great about thinking about it in terms of social and spatial justice is it really makes power at the center of it. It really insists on power and differential access to resources and as well as built space itself can't be ignored. And access and inclusion actually, I think, because it has this very nice common sense ring of, we're all in this together. I think it has its own inbuilt problem and limitations.
This is Amy. Yeah, I would say, like, Joss, what you were just saying was also reminding me that in this time when words like diversity, equity, and inclusion are being banned institutionally in a lot of spaces, like, it's an opportunity to think about what is it that we're really trying to say and work towards. And many of us have, often thought that diversity, equity, and inclusion don't go far enough and that we ought to do more. And so I really like the disability justice principles, and I think that there could even be more of them. But some of the ones that really come up a lot in the work that we do in critical design are leadership of the most impacted and kind of thinking about disabled people as experts and designers, and also collective access, that access isn't just a one and done thing. It's something that we all have to work towards as a society. And it's something that we do for each other, and also something that we, sometimes have guaranteed by law. And that, when we think about the many ways that disability has changed the world, it's one of those things is that disabled people have shown everyone how to take care of each other under really difficult conditions. And so that principle of collective access, I think, really stands out a lot to me. And then also intersectionality, because as we mentioned before, a lot of the attacks on disability rights come dressed in attacks on other communities too, and vice versa. And so we have to recognize that disabled people exist in every race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, and class, and that the actions that we take, the types of design that we pursue, benefit the most marginalized people as well.
Yeah, Joss, I love that sort of the critique you just made too of sort of access and inclusion, and I love it too. In the context of this conversation, I identify the sort of productive frictions of kind of Amy's work, which has chosen to kind of center access, but at the same time takes a very critical perspective and sort of expands from it. And many people in critical access studies even sort of challenge accessibility as a dominant framework, or I'm thinking of John Lee Clark's essay against access, or David Gisson's book, and also and being at the Institute for Human-Centered Design, where so much meaning has been made of kind of inclusion and sort of expanding what we mean by that. But I also think that critique kind of kind of asks us to sort of answer to that kind of position, which is what does you know, is there really just this like sense of like, you know, operating from a privileged position and saying, you know, I am unbothered in my view of the world. I'm just going to kind of like bring people into that. And I think John Lee Clark makes that point too, saying kind of like, you know, it's so often that people ask how he would like access to their spaces. John Lee Clark is a deafblind artist and an aesthetician and poet. But so rarely do they actually ask how they can access kind of deafblind culture or the kind of protectile language that he's creating, which is a sort of like version of American Sign Language that can be used through touch. So yeah, that really kind of like made me think about kind of that essay, and also sort of like different kind of like challenges that critique raises.
Should we maybe go to the last question so that we can do Q&A?
Yeah, of course. So the last question is kind of on a more positive note. It's asking, what is giving you hope, support, and resilience right now? And yeah, I think this is also a great opportunity to talk about everyone's upcoming projects and things that kind of we have going on, and then we can move to Q&A.
So something I'm really excited about is an upcoming summer school on disability and design that I'm working on with Critical Design Lab and also a lab at Northwestern called the Digital Apothecary Lab. And this is something we've really been working towards for like 10 years. So it's finally happening and really excited. And if anyone's interested, so it will have two parts. One is that we will have a lecture once a week that will be on Zoom, and it's free and open to everyone. There will be ASL and CART. And then you can also apply to be in a lab for the summer school. And that will mean that you'll work with 2 disabled designers and a small group of other people who are interested in disability and design to kind of apply critical access ideas to design projects. So we encourage you to send this out to people if you want to, or apply yourselves. It's great for students. And the website is there, labsforliberation.org. And the applications will be due on March 3rd. And this is basically kind of like part of why I'm excited for this is that we have for so long tried to get these types of conversations to happen within design schools, but it can be challenging because the curriculum is structured in a particular other way. And so this is an opportunity for us to get students who are interested in these ideas together in their own summer school, and then take the ideas back to their architecture and design schools. So I think it'll be really fun and exciting, and I hope to see some of you apply to it if you want to.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic thing. It's so exciting to know that that's happening this year. In terms of some kind of things that give me hope going forward, and remembering again, this is in the UK context, but I did want to say I put 2 projects up here. One is with a Black-led group called Maya in Birmingham, who are developing, they don't need us, they're developing this amazing project around the notion of abulas, around kind of radical hospitality. So community facilities that really redefine how that might be thought of, and that follow through in terms of thinking about how the project is financed, how it's managed. And in particular, our role is minor really in all of this, but it's to be co-convene a critical access committee. So although the architects they're working with are very supportive, it became really clear that it needs to be a very explicit dialogue about what disability justice means in this context, what it means in terms of their role, how they think about the design, and how local disabled people have a say in the development of the project itself. It's really kind of, I think it's just a great example of thinking about these things differently in the way that Amy was mentioning that it's a kind of slow and deliberate project for making a very different kind of building type. We're also working with, this has taken a very long time to get together, but with a very big international practice of architects called Foster Plus Partners. And we will be bringing a really huge variety of disabled lived experience and other kinds of lived experience into their understanding of buildings they've already made. And then that in turn will become a body of resources about both what the challenges are of those projects and alternative ways of thinking about them differently. And that will lead in turn to some practice design guides that will be used right across this big international practice in terms of how they, so they'll be implemented. And the aim is to actually look at, it's a bit like the aim of the podcast series in that the architects team there, we call it EDI here, Equality, Diversity, Inclusion. The EDI team will look quite explicitly about compliance and what the regulations demand, and we will be tying in with that and looking at how one might enrich that, but also recognise that they have to meet compliance requirements. And you've heard me talk before about impact. I think that we're really interested in what it is we can do that really makes a difference. And I just wanted to add, there's been a comment in the Q&A, a question in the Q&A about museums and museum design. Thank you, Jessica. And there is going to be an if anybody's in London this summer, I think it's June. Scar, you might have to correct me.
No, it's before June. I think it's actually the next slide, to be fair.
Oh, I'm not talking about your transology thing.
A different thing.
I'm talking about the Victoria and Albert Museum.
Oh, yeah, that is in June. That's in June.
A disability and design exhibition, a free exhibition on disability and design that is disability led. A curator, Natalie Kane, is leading on that, disabled curator, and the design. We work with the exhibition design team, and they really are. Whether any of it happens, what actually gets implemented, because it's a big, old-fashioned organisation, but the design team has really pushed forward. They've really thought about thinking about access and inclusion very differently. There's a lot of other examples of that, kind of emergent examples, but it feels really, again, really powerful that it would be happening at a big national institution like the Victoria and Albert Museum. Sorry, yeah, Sky, yeah.
Yeah, I was also going to add, from another perspective in terms of museums, there's also the trans-inclusive culture guidance for museums, which was produced in the UK. I think it's the University of Leicester link if you look for it. So in terms of kind of also matching up different understandings of what happens in museums and also how museums could kind of invite more people, those two in tandem, I think would be quite interesting. So hope, support, and resilience. Big words. I'm currently exhibition designer for quite a big exhibition, which is going to open on the 11th of March and run till the 11th of May, which is called Transestry. So 10 years of the Museum of Transology. So it's going to be a huge exhibition with over 1,000 objects which have been collected over the last 10 years, donated by trans, non-binary and intersex people. And most of them speak to the kind of everyday. And so we're bringing them all together into this kind of exhibition space. And it means that the exhibition has, because the whole issues are kind of around authorship and what happens in museum spaces and who curates and what goes in or what's considered not important. So we have these 1,000 objects. We think of it as having more like 1,000 curators. And they each have a little brown tag. And the brown tags are written by each person who's donated them, because there's also this thing around the erasure of trans people being authors of their own experience. So we maintain that, and the tag becomes as important as the object itself. So the thing that's kind of given me energy at the moment is we're doing that. We've got we've got 1,000 curators. We've got over 100 volunteers who are coming into the space and helping us build it. And we've got a big kind of project team of kind of at least over 25. So if anyone happens to be, I mean, I know we're doing this based in the US, but if anyone happens to be in London between the 11th of March and the 11th of May, it's a free exhibition in near King's Cross, and it will probably take you a good 5 days, possibly 7 days to get around it. So you might need to change plans. But we would be more than happy to have you. And then specifically the groups that people who are giving me energy right now is all of the gossip from the volunteers, which is amazing. And particularly we've got a group of under 18s, the Trans Kids Deserve Better, who are very politically active. And I feel like I could learn a lot from them. But learning about their different outfits and also mishaps and protests, they released 6,000 crickets at the LGB Alliance conference not that long ago. Which, if you don't know, the LGB Alliance is a trans exclusionary charity that was set up, queer charity that was set up. So they snuck in and released these crickets. So particularly that kind of those conversations and those understandings of trying to work out how to kind of like how to get in there are giving me a lot of life at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, thank you all for that. And yeah, I think this is a great time to kind of like open up the conversation a little more in the time we have left with the audience. We have a bunch of questions. And yeah, I think I know that we've all kind of been looking at the Q&A and looking with my magnifier. I'm going to be a little bit of a slow reader. So maybe the best way to do it is we can kind of pick out questions that we think, we want to answer, and then other people can jump in. So we can maybe take a moment, jump into the Q&A, and I know there's one, it said more of a comment than a question, but let's all have a look and then potentially respond a bit.
There's one from Jennifer Meekins that maybe we could start with. So Jennifer says, I'm a professor of interiors and architecture in the US and actually left professional practice because of the rigid and conservative nature of architecture practice broadly, unwilling to progress access and equity in the built environment. I saw teaching as a means to teach students these critical concepts before getting into an office. So all of that is to say, what is the role of the design studio and design faculty in advancing disability justice and going beyond access? And what are the challenges from your perspective, especially as ideas of equity, inclusion, and diversity are under attack? So Jennifer, you're kind of like one of our ideal audiences for this project and for the projects that our labs and organizations have been working on, because what we wanted to make really easy, and hopefully the final products will do this, is for someone who is teaching in a studio context to take up these concepts and to be able to work with them really easily or to integrate them into existing projects. And some of the inspiration for that actually comes from a kind of legendary architecture studio at Berkeley in the 70s from Ray Lifshay and Barbara Winslow, who not only brought disabled people into the architecture studio, but they made it very clear that the disabled clients were the experts and that they were there to question everyone's assumptions. And there's this amazing documentary about it that you can watch on YouTube, actually, where the whole documentary is just the disabled clients, asking all the architecture students why they design things in certain ways and really challenging them. And I think it's like the sort of granularity of that, and like that kind of like the architecture studio is the site where people learn, and they don't just learn how to practice, but they actually learn what kinds of questions they need to ask. So I would love to get your feedback also, like as these materials come out, if you end up using them. I'll find the link to the documentary real quick and post it in the chat.
Yeah, and I think I mean, for me, because I think this is actually where the Disordinary Architecture Project started, really. We got Arts Council funding, UK Arts Council funding to work with faculty, with students, and just explore different ways in which we could bring these kind of critical concepts in a way that was very productive and enjoyable, and not like sitting in a long talk about how you've got to get all this access stuff correct for compliance. So we wanted to really kind of shift the understanding and bring creative disabled people into those spaces where they're often in large numbers, so that it wasn't just like the one wheelchair user who becomes the kind of reference point, as if they represent everybody who uses a wheelchair. I think the big challenges are, for me, and I'd be interested again what Amy and Scar have to say with this, the big challenges for me are how extraordinarily embedded both assumptions about disability are as a problem, as something to be fearful of, as a kind of a real disavowal of that for non-disabled students, particularly young people, of that. And then I think of how it becomes within the way you study and the way that you train and the way the profession is organized as a problem to be solved, with, like, at the end of you design a building for non-disabled people, and then right at the end you kind of have to slot in things for all the people you've already left out, which is a weird thing, but it's like the norm. And that there's so little time, you're under such pressure, and you're dealing with so many variables as a student and in practice, that you just want the solution. You want a solution that sorts it out. And of course, in a way, the regulations, the code does that. It kind of appears very to give a solution, which in fact it doesn't. And so for me, some of this is actually working together to build ways in which we can have multiple solutions. You know, we can actually understand we can get to know the variety of ways of being in the world, and the way that people occupy space, and provide alternatives. Don't just assume that there is like a compromise solution that will work for everybody. That's kind of built into the way that the code works, that's kind of there will be an answer. Here it is. We can draw it for you. So I think it is about recognizing the kind of productive frictions, recognizing the tensions and complexities, and accepting that you're not, there isn't like a solution. And that's very much, so a lot of it for us has been about changing mindsets. It's about getting people to actually engage with their world, non-disabled people mainly, engage with their world differently.
I was going to say, to follow on from that, so Scar here, to say that I think I feel like it's a little bit to do with the way in which people are taught before they even get to university, and before they even encounter some of these quite embedded ideas in architecture. But the practice of rote learning as a way of gathering information or learning just as a practice is almost quite counterproductive to the kind of way in which we need to be thinking about, from a very like felt perspective, the way in which different people experience space. And I've definitely noticed with students that when they've come from more of a culture around rote learning, there's a little bit more rigidity and a little bit more about wanting to know a solution or wanting to be able to follow through a series of steps. And so a lot of that is about just unpicking for them being able to actually, like, I think Josh said it a while back about that there needs to be this moment where there is also this movement towards understanding their own felt experience, and that to feel kind of important and valid, and then to be able to really understand that, or try and kind of open themselves up to understanding that from multiple different points of view. Whereas when we come in with this rote perspective, there needs to be this creative process of kind of unpicking that happens, so that they feel there's a kind of freedom that then happens, and there's an openness that then occurs. And also we were talking about, James Acker-Haas, who's one half of Dis Collective, which is also it's a disability collective that's based in London. We've been teaching together, and all of our conversations, a lot of it has been about not necessarily teaching people the right way to do things, but how do we change the way in which people just feel or think about different spatial conditions and occupy space, and that kind of cat. The teaching and the pedagogy that goes alongside that becomes so important, because actually those lessons of kind of feeling taken care of in that space, they extend well beyond the classroom. They're kind of like important life lessons as well as important professional lessons to learn, of interacting with different people and designing for different people as well, and bringing people into conversations and relieving control. It's all important parts of operating in the world. Yeah. Amy, do you have any thoughts?
I don't think I have anything else to add.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask if maybe if there is like one more question, or I'm also happy to wrap it up if people are feeling done, whatever we're ready for.
I think interestingly, the question that Amy picked is there are other questions that very much relate to it. So it feels like what we've been talking about does kind of respond to quite a range of Q&A input. I don't know if there's anything in the chat we should be responding to finally. There's certainly been, I think, the request to have a list of references. I'm sure this is something that will happen anyway, but there's definitely requests from several people to have references.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I was going to say, so the critical access primer will probably, we're kind of working towards getting a kind of like compiled book version together, which will likely be released kind of concurrently with Labs for Liberation, which will be this summer. And I know many more parts than M, which is kind of an amazing compendium, is on the Disordinary Architecture Project website, which people can access, and you know, we can definitely look into sending that to people. I think I saw there was a question about contacting IHCD, and I'm gonna just give you the director's email, Valerie Fletcher, which is, let me make sure I have it right. Yep, vfletcher@ihcdesign.org, and Fletcher is FLECHER. Yeah, and I saw that there was a lot of really great activity in the chat, people from all over, and you know, some really cool disability activists and artists as well. So I'm really excited that we were all able to get together and have this conversation. Amy, Josh, this was a really, you know, huge thing for me to be able to do, and I you know, have loved listening to the past hour and a half. So just wanted to give a big thank you, and also a thank you to everyone who tuned in. And I think we can leave it there. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
And thank you for moderating, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you, Valerie, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Huge pleasure. All right. Bye, everyone.